Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the kitchen here at House at Long Meadow. Today is a big day here in the kitchen. We are getting ready to bake all of our sourdough bread needs for the next few weeks. So we stay pretty busy around here between kids and gardening and animals and homeschool and all the other activities that we do outside of our home. But it's still important and we still make it a priority to bake with sourdough here in our kitchen. We really feel like sourdough bread is the best choice. It's a wonderful addition to our diet. And this fermented sourdough or fermented bread is really great and easily digested. It has wonderful flavor, and we prefer it over store-bought bread. And so, even though we are busy, we make it a priority here in our kitchen. So the way that I make sourdough a priority in our kitchen, while also not spending a lot of time maintaining a sourdough starter, is by keeping a dry sourdough starter. It's also known as a stiff sourdough starter. You can tell my starter is not bubbly and overflowing the top of the jar. It's very stiff, very dry, almost like a really thick dough. And so by using a stiff sourdough starter, I'm only pulling from this jar when I want to bake something. I'm not maintaining my starter every day or even once a week. And that means I'm using a lot less flour to maintain the health of my starter. It also means that I'm not having to figure out recipes or things to do with the discard that typically comes with a really wet, active, bubbly starter. And so for me, for this time in my life when I want to make sourdough a priority in my kitchen, but I don't have a lot of extra time to dedicate to my starter or a myriad of sourdough recipes, a stiff sourdough starter is a really great option for me and my kitchen. So, what is a stiff sourdough starter? It's the same thing as your wet sourdough starter, except that when we feed the sourdough starter, I'm feeding it a much higher flour to water ratio. So typically your wet or your standard sourdough starters are going to be fed on a 1:1:1 ratio, meaning we're taking, say, 50 grams of starter and feeding it 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. Well, in this case, when I am feeding my starter to put away in the fridge, I'm feeding it a 1:2 ratio. So I'm going to give it, say, 100 grams of water to 200 grams of flour. And what that does is it creates a very stiff sourdough starter. This gives the yeast in my sourdough starter a lot of extra flour or a lot of extra food to eat on when it's away in my fridge for several weeks. Now you can see my starter is much stiffer. It's been in the fridge for about 3 weeks. I think that was the last time I pulled from it, was about 2.5 or 3 weeks ago. There's no liquid or hooch, as you would call it, on the top of the jar, signaling to me that my starter is hungry. It smells very yeasty and almost yogurt-like, and so my starter is still very much alive and very healthy. So I've got a few recipes that we're going to bake over the next couple of days. And I wanted to bring you guys along on that journey and show you just how easy and hands-off a stiff sourdough starter can be and how easy it is to implement sourdough baking into your life, even if you're busy or you're a working mom outside the home, it's still very practical to bring sourdough baking into your kitchen. So this week, I'm going to be prepping some sourdough rolls that we are going to have with our Easter lunch. I'm going to get those baked up this week and put in the freezer so that those can be pulled out on Easter Sunday for a really quick and wonderful sourdough roll. And then I'm also going to be making our sandwich loaves for the next couple of weeks and some just rustic sourdough loaves for a couple of friends and a couple to throw back in the freezer. We always like to keep some on hand to take to a friend's house for dinner or to pull out at the last minute for lunch or dinner. Okay, so all that I need to get these recipes started for the week are a couple of bowls. I've got my sourdough starter. I've got some unbleached all-purpose flour, and I've also got some warm water. Now, I typically do warm my water because when I'm pulling my starter out of the fridge, it is very cold, and so warm water helps to awaken the yeast in the sourdough starter and get it moving along a little more quickly. So, for my first recipe, I'm just mixing up the leaven for the roll recipe that we're going to use for Easter. Now, I'm going to mix it up separately than the loaves that I'm doing for the rest of the week. I'll just pull sourdough starter out of this bowl as I need it for our normal bread recipes. Okay, so for my roll recipe, I'm making a double batch of these sourdough rolls. So to make the active sourdough starter for this recipe, I'm going to pull 30 grams of starter. Again, you can see how stiff my starter is, almost like a dough. We're gonna pull 30 grams. That's 33. Almost eyeballed it. All right, 30 grams of starter. And then I'm going to feed it 100 grams of water and 100 grams of flour. There's my 100 grams of water. I'm going to stir that up. All right. And then we're going to mix in 100 grams of our unbleached all-purpose flour. Okay. And then all I'm going to do is stir this together. I'm going to pop the lid on this fed sourdough starter, and I'm going to set that aside until later this evening when I get ready to mix up those loaves. While this is setting to the side for the next 8 or so hours, my starter is going to waken up. It's going to get nice and active, and this will be a perfect leaven for our sourdough rolls. There we go. So, sourdough starter activated and ready for one recipe. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is mix up sourdough starter for just our daily bread needs. So for each batch of sourdough bread that I make, it takes about 200 grams of starter. I'm making one batch of sourdough sandwich loaves, and I'm making 2 batches of my rustic sourdough loaves. So I need about 600 grams of active sourdough starter in this bowl. So I'm gonna take some sourdough starter out. You don't have to be really picky with this. Usually it's just about 50 or 75 grams when I'm making about this much. That's about 50. I'm gonna do just a little bit more. And I know that I need 600 grams of active sourdough starter in order to leaven those other loaves. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 300 grams of water and about 300 grams of my unbleached all-purpose flour to this starter. All we're going to do is just waken that starter up, let it get nice and active, and then we'll pull from this one bowl as we mix up our next few recipes throughout the next day or so. That's a little over 300 grams of water. I'm going to get my sourdough mixed in there. Inevitably, when I have a cold sourdough starter, I always have to kind of go in with my hands. The thing about sourdough is it's very active and alive, and the more you bake with it, the more you use it in your kitchen. You're almost populating your own kitchen, populating your area with these live, active sourdough cultures. And so using your hands kind of helps spread those active cultures around your kitchen. Okay, so I've fed it 300 grams of water. Now I'm going to go in with 300 grams of unbleached all-purpose flour. All right. Get this nice and mixed up. I'll cover this bowl, set it to the side till later on this evening, and then we'll pull from it to mix up our sandwich loaves. So while sourdough has gotten really popular over the last few years, I think there are a lot of people that are still intimidated by maintaining a sourdough starter. And so my hopes for this video is to show you just how simple it can be to maintain a sourdough starter, and that it really doesn't have to add to or complicate your life all that much to have really good home-baked bread. All right, we're gonna pop the lid on this. I'm going to set this to the side till later on this evening, and we'll be on our way to having some really wonderful bread. Now, I still have plenty of starter left in my jar, so typically I would not feed my sourdough starter at this point. I would just pop it back in the fridge, pull it out again in a couple of weeks, and bake another batch of sourdough bread. But for the purposes of this video, I'll show you how I feed my sourdough starter. So all I'm going to do is feed it that much higher ratio of flour to water. I'm going to zero out my scale, and I'm going to feed it. I just added 100 grams of water. I'm going to get that mixed in. So typically I'll let my jar get down to about 50 or 30 grams of starter before I feed it again. So it could be a month or so before I feed my starter. So I'm using very little flour compared to, say, someone who maintains a sourdough starter every single day. And like I said, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with keeping a wet sourdough starter. If you have the time and the ability and you bake that much, but we just don't have the time for that here. And so maintaining a stiff starter is just much more practical for us. Okay, sorry, let me zero this back out. So I fed my starter 100 grams of water. So to prep it to go back into the fridge, I'm going to give it 200 grams of flour. All right, there we go. All right. We're gonna get it as incorporated as we can. Now it looks very dry when you first mix up a stiff sourdough starter. Let me kind of show you. So when I first feed my starter, it's kind of got this consistency. It's very, very thick, very dry, almost a little bit crumbly. I'm gonna put the lid on this and I'm gonna leave it out for about 6 or 8 hours, and I'm gonna let it start to kind of wake up and get active. At that point, once it starts to kind of liven up a little bit, that's when I will put it away in my fridge until I'm ready to pull from it and bake again in a couple of weeks. All right, stay tuned and we'll keep on baking later on today. All right, I'm gonna do my best to walk you guys through all the sourdough baking. So later on the same day, I'm mixing up all the ingredients for my roll recipe. I'm just using that sourdough starter that we mixed up separately. I gave it about 6 hours or so to get activated. Got that dough mixed up, and now it's gonna go into a bowl to sit for about an hour or so and let all that flour get absorbed. While that dough's resting, I am just mixing up the ingredients for our sandwich loaf recipe. All that's just going right into my stand mixer, and that will do all of the hard work for me. I'm pulling from that large bowl of sourdough starter that we mixed up earlier this morning. It is nice and active and bubbly, so I'm pulling just what I need for this recipe. While that sandwich dough is going in my mixer, I'm going to do just some stretch and folds on my roll recipe. I think I do 2 or 3 stretch and folds on these rolls before I let them bulk rise. All right, checking the sourdough sandwich bread, making sure that it's been mixed well enough. That's just going to get covered, and it's going to bulk ferment at room temp just overnight. All right, the next morning I am pulling my rolls out of the fridge. I let those cold ferment overnight, and I'm gonna let those get nice and puffy. Meanwhile, my sandwich dough is all ready to be shaped. So I'm getting that all out, and we're gonna get those into the loaf pans so they can do their second rise while we're just going about our morning. So this is the sourdough starter left in our bowl, and after about 18 hours it is still nice and bubbly and active. So right into this same bowl I'm going to mix in all the ingredients for my 4 rustic sourdough loaves. This is a pretty high hydration dough, and so it's quite shaggy at the beginning, a really wet dough. So typically I will let this sit for about an hour before I come back and start doing my stretch and folds throughout the morning. Meanwhile, we just go about our business, get our school done, chores done, and that dough just happily sits on the counter and does its fermentation. You can see by the end of the stretch and folds that dough has come together and stiffened up quite a bit more. Still a high hydration dough. All right, around lunchtime, our sourdough sandwich loaves and our rolls for Easter are nice and risen and ready to be baked. So I am getting those loaves in, getting those baked, and then the sourdough rolls pop in right after. All right, it is after dinner at this point, and the kiddos are all headed to bed. I am pulling out that dough that's been bulk rising all day for our rustic sourdough loaves. I am going to get those pre-shaped and just let those sit for about 30 minutes to just make sure that they can hold their structure when we get ready to finish these loaves off. While this may seem like a lot of steps, I am going to finish off 6 total loaves of bread and 2 pans of sourdough loaves in these 2 days. And all of these steps just happened in the margins of my day, just in the sidelines, not taking a lot of time or effort from me to complete this. All right, now I'm just finishing the final shaping of these 4 rustic loaves. I'm just tucking them in and giving them one final little shape just to help them hold a really nice structure when we bake these off tomorrow morning. I'm going to get them covered and into the fridge to cold ferment overnight. Alright, these loaves have been cold fermenting all night in the fridge, and I've got my oven preheated, and we're going to get these loaves in and bake them up. Just going to give them a quick score, and then they're going to go into a really hot oven until they're nice and crusty and delicious. Thank you guys for joining me in the kitchen this week as we've baked some really wonderful sourdough bread. A stiff sourdough starter is such an easy way to maintain a healthy starter even for the busiest of schedules. Now, this bread is nice and warm, and we can never wait for it to cool down before we break into it. So we're about to slice into some bread and get to eating. It's nice and warm. Hold on, put some butter on it for you. That one's yours. Here you go. All right, sis. Dear. Have the puzzle. If you enjoy the content that we've been sharing with you, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiration for your table, your hearth, and your soil. I hope that you will join us again. See you next time.